So you're very welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a million.
Thanks so much for joining me. I know you travelled up from Wexford today, so
It's great to be here.
thanks very much. So John, you founded the Irish Men's Shed Association back in 2011. So for anyone who doesn't know what that is, can you give us a brief overview of exactly what the Irish Men's Shed Association is?
Yeah, sure. So the Men's Sheds Association, we were a national body set up to support all the men's sheds in the country, or to support any community who wanted to set up a men's shed, which were very new at the time. So really to have an agency there that would have the know-how and a bit of support to help any community set up a men's shed. That's what we were all about.
Okay, and what exactly is a men's shed?
So a men's shed is really any kind of community space where guys can come together, like to work on activities, whether it is woodwork or metalwork. If you looked into a shed, you typically see things like woodworking machines or broken equipment, and there'd be a few guys pottering around. But really, they're just the tools to bring people together to, I suppose, motivate for the social interaction that guys get from participating in a men's shed, where they make lots of friends and have lots of fun.
Great. And I saw something on the website, and it was about the fact that men communicate with each other shoulder to shoulder as opposed to face to face. So
yeah, that would have been the motto of the men's sheds, and it would have emerged in Australia just a little while before 2011. A friend of mine now, he wasn't at the time, Barry Golden, heard that in a shed, and it ended up in the research, and it ended up in the kind of motto of the association that men don't talk face to face, they talk shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, and I think it really resonates with people, and people get what we try and do from those few simple words.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, John. So I'd like to start off by going back to the time in your life before the association was set up. So would you be able to tell us a little bit about your life at the time and how you saw the need for the Irish Men's Shed Association in your community?
Yeah, sure. So it wouldn't have been a straight line. I would have been from a farming background, and I was farming up until I was about 27. And perhaps I'd experienced some of the issues that would have given me some empathy for some of the stuff that some of the guys in the sheds would have experienced, but that would have been much later. So from about 2002, I changed career from farming, started working in an area where, generally just with people, but it started off volunteering in youth work and so on, and ended up working in community development. And in around 2005, got a pilot piece of work trying to get men involved in community activity. It was in New Ross in County Wexford, and I suppose up until that point, it was a pilot piece of work because up until that point, really, the vast majority of people who participated in organised community activity were women, whether that was community development or community education or health promotion projects. And I suppose that was based on the success of the women's community education movement, which would have started in the late 70s and the 80s, which in fact the men's shed movement learned loads from, and basically that women's community education movement, the women used to meet around kitchen tables and have a cuppa or two and talk about how they can help themselves and how they can help their communities. And men's sheds are very similar, except they're in sheds instead of in kitchens. So that was around 2005. We learned a lot from that project. A colleague of mine saw about men's sheds in Australia around that time, mentioned just online, did you see this thing, perked their interest. But then really, I suppose the game changer was the recession in 2008 and 9, and suddenly there was tens of thousands of guys in Ireland who were unemployed. Probably had big mortgages, maybe struggling in terms of bit of mental health issues, not knowing how they're going to support their families and pay mortgages and stuff. And really, Ireland was crying out for something for guys, a very kind of low entry level, I suppose, sport mechanism. And we didn't really have anything like that. And then the other thing that really made a good opportunity at the time was men's sheds are very, very cost effective. So because of the recession, there was no money in state agencies. There was a lot of cutbacks for community and health promotion stuff, just because we didn't have the money in the country. And so we had to find a way of doing both those things, finding the support for guys while also not having any money to do it.
Yeah, so the timing was perfect.
The timing was perfect, yeah.
Yeah. And had that idea been something that you'd been thinking about for a few years prior to the recession, and then you thought that this was the time to go for it? Or how did you make that decision?
Yeah, so it wouldn't have all been on me now. I'm very proud to have been a part of the story,
Yes.
but really, um, well, when we were doing that pilot piece of work in Euros, we would have been endeavouring to do, we didn't call it a men's shed at a time, but something similar where like we had a community space and we had pool tables and guys could come in and they could do music or have a breakfast or something. So it was the model, but we weren't calling it a men's shed. And then during that time, when the recession hit and the idea, I was lucky enough to connect with Barry Golden, who I mentioned earlier, and he was visiting Ireland in 2008 to do some presentations on the research he'd done into men's sheds in Australia. And we met him here in Dublin, and like it was just like, all right, this is the right thing for Ireland, all right. And I got to go back to Australia the following year to the Australian Men's Sheds Association conference. Um, and that's really when, like, on that trip, as well as going to the conference, I visited several sheds in Australia, and that was really when the penny dropped that this just makes so much sense and it needs to be happening in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and like, because one of the pieces of information, I suppose, that stuck with me most from that trip was that, like, men's sheds had been around in Australia since about 1996. I think the first shed was in a place called Lane Cove in northern Sydney. And between 2006 and, 1996 and 2005, sheds in Australia had grown to about 70. So it was significant, but not exponential. And then in 2005, like, they brought everybody involved in those sheds together and set up the Australian Men's Sheds Association. And as soon as they had the Men's Sheds Association, the movement in Australia began to grow exponentially. And I said, like,
Okay.
that's the piece that I needed to do in Ireland, rather than helping one or two or three or five sheds, is like to set up a mechanism that could help everywhere have a men's shed if they wanted one.
Yeah. And
Um, and
15 years later, there's now 450. So it
yeah,
definitely
it
worked.
worked. It worked
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
And was there anything whenever you went to Australia and you were looking at the model they were using there, was there anything that you had to change before you implemented it in Ireland?
Um, Well, I suppose every men's shed is different, which, like, and it's unique to its community. So in that sense, the essence and the principle are the very same. But yeah, if you went into, you could have a shed in a city where space is very precious, and it could be like, a small unit, and there mightn't be much room for woodworking equipment or whatever, but guys still go there for the camaraderie and the cup of tea. And equally, you could have a shed out in the country with in a big purpose-built, shed with, like, where you can park loads of vehicles and
Mm-hmm.
everything. But actually, the value that the guys get out of it is the very same. That they get that camaraderie and the friendship and the sense of belonging and the sense of purpose and all those things that the
Yeah.
men's sheds have on offer. So that piece was the same. I think, like, the concept of men's sheds had kind of jumped across the globe around 2008 or 9. So when we tried to bring people together who were involved in men's sheds in Ireland for the first time in 2010, like, there was already about 7 groups that were setting up men's sheds. The first
Okay.
one was in Tipperary, but there was also ones happening in Galway and in Arklow and in County Meath and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of the real kind of, I suppose, solidifying moment. I think it was late 2010 when they came together for the first time and said, right, let's do this as a movement, as opposed to just people doing
Yes.
things separately.
And then, so you were talking there a bit about how the idea behind each men's shed is the exact same, but the facilities are up to the individual area depending on if it's in a city or a country. So does the individual who sets up the men's shed, they have autonomy over kind of what direction it takes, if it's more of a workshop versus if it's more of a sit down and having a conversation?
Yeah, very typically, that would be the case. We would say that, yeah. So it wouldn't be just one individual, and I think that's one of the things we learned from the start, is when the guy wanted to set up a men's shed, to get a small number of kind of co-founders or
Yeah.
guys around them, and that team that get it set up would have a lot of autonomy, and that we would have said from the start that kind of each men's shed is autonomous, except if it, like, was doing stuff that was unacceptable, obviously selling drugs or whatever.
Yeah.
The bar is fairly low, like, do you know. uh, but yeah, and but they are quite different, and it depends on the interests of the men involved. And one of the cool things is, like, not all the men have to be doing the same thing. So you could go into a men's shed
Mm-hmm.
and you could have guys, who are making I don't know, bait to go fishing in one corner. You could have lads like renovating an old car at the other side, or maybe a pool table, or maybe, you know, 4 or 5 lads just sitting around the table playing cards. But not everybody has to be doing. It's not programmatic. It's
Yes.
very kind of like, you
It's a
know, it's a
creative
space.
outlet,
Yeah, it's
nearly.
a space to share. Yeah. So.
Okay, that's excellent. Yeah. So you talked about the fact that you went over to Australia, you saw the model, you came back, you maybe tweaked one or two things. What were the some of the challenges at the very beginning whenever you were first setting up? You and the other founders were setting up the Irish Men's Shed Association.
Um,
Without being negative,
yeah, no,
to
well,
some of the
some of
challenges.
it was really interesting, and maybe the power of communications. So I remember, like, so our first bit of funding was
Hmm.
through the Arthur Guinness Fund back in the day, about 2012. And so Guinness has had this fund set up to support social enterprises, social entrepreneurs. And but they also had some non-financial supports. And I remember doing a workshop on comms and how we're going to use social media, and to be really clear about our goals. And I just like had this kind of moment where I was like, all I want is for people to know what a men's shed is. Like, I was sick of saying, people say, what is a men's shed? And
Hmm.
like 15 times a week trying to explain it and say. So the objective was within a year to use our socials to, so that people would know what a men's shed. It wasn't to sell anything, it wasn't to try and grow anything. And I think that really worked. You know, it wasn't just down to our social media strategy, of course, but it was down, like, but those first couple of years, when, like, I was going around the place banging on about men's sheds and nobody knew what they were, that
Hmm.
was really frustrating. Whereas,
Yeah.
like, you know, a few years later, when people understand what they are, makes it a lot easier.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It takes a while for it to be a household name, but now, like I know in my house at home, there's three men's sheds in our local vicinity,
Wow.
so they're everyone knows exactly what it is now. But that is the power of a good communication strategy. So
Yeah.
that was kind of one of the barriers at the very start, but it's the same, I suppose, with any organization or association. It takes a little bit of a while for everything to kind of fall into place.
It does, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And it's a challenge, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And how was the funding as well? Was it easy to come across, or was it very difficult? No one's going to come knocking at the door with funding.
Yeah, so I think that would have been a very kind of classical social entrepreneur journey.
Hmm.
Uh, and while it seems like funding was really difficult at the time, and every funding success was a huge win,
Hmm.
looking back, it was actually, you know, quite successful, and that we did attract funding from relatively early on,
Hmm.
compared to like what I know some people are struggling with. And I suppose it was just the timing was right for the idea, you
Yeah.
know, and funders came around and supported us quite quickly. You know, not long after that first piece of funding. So the Ireland Fund supported us, Social Entrepreneurs Ireland supported us. And then maybe a year or two later, the Department of Rural and Community Development supported us. So, uh, in real terms, that happened quite quickly. But at the
Hmm.
time, it was a struggle, and it seemed really slow and really hard. You
Yes,
know,
of
and
course.
like I remember we were often like within 2 or 3 weeks of running out of money. But we always got the next little bit until it grew a bit, you know. So
Yeah,
there was a bit about like that's just the journey of a startup, whether
of
it's
course.
a social thing or not, I think.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think that goes the same for no matter what organization, or sector you're in. It's the same at the very start. So, is there any standout moments that you remember from the very beginning and setting it up that stand out as highlights to you?
Ah, yeah, there'll be quite a few. Um,
Hard to pick one, but you
hard
could go through
hard
two or
to
three.
hard to pick one now,
Yeah.
and it's a long time ago as well. Like I was because I'm no longer with the men's sheds, and I was just reminiscing on my way up today. It's actually, I think it's like 9 years this month when I moved away from the men's sheds. So time is flying, so
Yeah.
I hope my memory is good. But some of the good things that stand out now that you asked that question, one would have been, I remember really clearly where I was when I got the phone call to say that we got that first bit of funding, which was 50 grand over 2 years. And because that meant for me, I packed in my job and I used that money as my salary for the 2 years,
Okay.
you know. So that was kind of a big move, and I was able to put full capacity into it. And like, it would have been uh, a sequence of events, including having a conversation with my wife Sarah about like, will I do this? Because I had a good job that I was giving up and stuff
Yeah.
like that, you know. So that was, and she was fully supportive, and it was great. It was great crack in terms of the journey as well. I also remember a couple of years later we got the president, Michael D, agreed to be our patron.
Yeah.
And I remember getting that phone call as well. It was also in the car. And that was very exciting. That like a big sense of, geez, we've arrived here.
We've made it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, and then some of the other things are much more smaller moments that, like, even many years later, even might be in a shop or wherever, and people don't know I've anything to do with the men's sheds, and you just hear people talking about their local men's shed, or you know, or whatever, or see a sign for the local men's shed when you're going through a town or something. I get great satisfaction out of that.
Oh, of course. And I think it's amazing. Like previously in rural communities, there only might have been the pub or the GAA pitch where people, men especially of a particular age, came together and actually opened up and communicated. But there was no one place for everyone to come together and, as you said earlier, stand kind of shoulder to shoulder. So it really closed the gap for rural communities, especially.
Yeah, I think so. I think there was obviously a big demand, so the product market fit was good.
Yes.
We didn't have any of that language at the time.
No.
Yeah. And interestingly, like you say, the pub or the bookies and stuff, and while they play a role, you know, there's also a lot of people, I suppose, have bad experiences, you know, whether that's with alcohol or gambling addictions or whatever. So and even it's very interesting, like if you look at bookies, you can learn a lot. Like, you know, they're really usually very comfortable spaces. They've free tea and coffee. They've a lot of the stuff going on that you can learn, like what attracts guys into somewhere, you know.
Take the positive elements from those spaces and take away the gambling.
But and obviously there's big issues with alcohol in Ireland as well. So there's lots of guys who be like intentionally trying to stay out of pubs, and you know, they're trying to stay off the beer and everything. So having an alternative to that is really important too.
Oh, it's massively important. And I saw that there's up to now over 12,000 men regularly attending the 450 sheds across Ireland. At the time, whenever you were first setting it up, did you ever consider that there would be that magnitude now 15 years later?
I don't think so. I
No.
think that was bigger than even, like, I would have thought big at the time. I remember like following, you know, those exercises to help you think big, and one of them was to like write a press release like in 2 years' time, and I think we had it up to 150 sheds, and that was the biggest we could think of, you know, because even we'd done maths and around like the number of sheds per head of population, and like so. Like there's more sheds per population in Ireland than there are anywhere else in the world, like more than Australia or New Zealand or wherever, where they've been quite established. So yeah, it definitely has exceeded our expectations.
Yeah, I know it's amazing to see the growth that it has. And then to talk a little bit more about your role. So you moved into more of a global position. So you moved into the project manager, I suppose, looking at just the Irish men's shed, moving into that position. How was that? You probably had to change a lot of your goals, your mindset, how you worked.
Yeah, so there's a few things happened there, like, and if I'm being really open, like a part of it was, like I mentioned, it was around 9 years ago, so in around 2014, or 14 or 15, I would have got burnt out, like I remember, because I'd been going just non-stop around Ireland and further afield to help people set up men's sheds, and there was a lot of people interested in men's sheds from outside of Ireland. I remember probably in 2013 and 14, like I was hopping, you know, invited to speak at conferences in lots of European countries and stuff, and it was very exciting at the time. But I also realised, or found out fairly bluntly, that like I was burnt out. So part of that, like my change in role, had been, I first had to step back from my role as the CEO of the Irish Men's Sheds Association, and I needed time off. I was like, it was quite, I suppose, ironic or whatever, that I'd been like going around the country or around Europe helping guys look after their well-being, and like forgot to look after my own. So I took some time off. I'd planned to take a year off and come back in the Irish role, but at the end of that year, like I realised, well, the guy who they had in replacing me was doing a great job, and I wasn't really ready to come back anyway. And the international stuff was interesting, and it wasn't as established, so gave that a go for a while. But it would have been more of a consequences of the circumstances rather than a very kind of planned strategic move.
Yeah, I understand. It probably took a lot for you to step away from that role, and even though you were happy with the person who was fulfilling it at the time, it probably took a long time for you to come to that decision and think, well, if I'm being burnt out, the purpose of what I'm doing here is to help men, so I actually need to stop and help myself first of all.
Yeah, well, that would have been definitely the case. Like I was, so I like, I mean, I have a certain level of understanding of mental health issues, and I was properly burnt out. Like I didn't have a
Yeah.
choice. Do you
No.
know? It wasn't like, so I didn't have a
Yeah.
choice. So, but in hindsight, like everything happens for a reason, and like the journey continued for both me and for Men's Sheds. And I think, it's great to be able to look back now, and that the Irish Men's Sheds Association, has gone through like a number of, I suppose, changes and growth spurts and challenges, most notably COVID,
Hmm.
like over the year, and it's still there and it's still flourishing, and that's something to be very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to look at it
Yeah.
as it currently is, and be proud of where it is, which you definitely should be. So, in terms of your career change, you're still within the sector and you're working for Grow Remote now. Do you want to talk a little bit about your position now and Grow Remote as an organization?
Yeah, I will. Thanks. Um, so I suppose, yeah, luckily enough, I have found myself in a role that I'm equally passionate about as I was about Men's Sheds at the time. There's some very like direct links. Both organisations were, like, I suppose, set up to support rural and regional development and to enhance community life and community activity. Kind of funny if people don't understand how you think remote work does the opposite. It's like
Yeah.
working remotely, not bringing people together. But actually, it's like, so it helps people so they don't have to commute. They don't have to leave the towns and villages that they live in, either migrate or commute. That they get to live and work and participate locally. They get to invest their time locally and their money locally. And yeah, we're all about that, and we can see the impact that a few remote jobs can bring to a community, as opposed to those few people, maybe commuting for a few hours every day and spending their money in a petrol station. They can spend it in the local coffee shop, just for example.
Hmm.
Yeah, Grow Remote has been set up a few years, and yeah, we're kind of doing everything we can to, like, help people live and work and participate locally. We believe remote working will get people there, but we're not. It's quite interesting. We have to, like, the kind of thriving communities is our mission, is our goal. But if cheese making helps people, like, achieve that goal, we'd be helping people make cheese. It's just that remote working happens to be the thing that we feel is most likely to help communities thrive and have a balanced kind of regional development
Yeah,
for the country. Yeah.
absolutely. And I was actually at a exhibition recently, and it was talking about developing rural community hubs that people can work in, they can engage with each other, and that, as you say, you're not losing out to the drain of people commuting to the bigger cities.
Mm.
It's that you have these community hubs that are developed in more rural areas, and people can work and socialize together, and doing that same model.
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, you know, uh, the hubs that are across the country, and I think there's around 300 of them now, they fulfill a lot of the roles for remote workers and for other community members that Mencheds do. It's just like, so any place that people come together in a community, like co-create, bring their energy, bring their positivity, is just brilliant. And we need as much of that as possible, you
And
know.
even more so, I was reading something recently, and it was talking about our generation, so Gen Z, and it's how we see our third space. So first space being your home,
Home, yeah.
second being your place of work, and your third place being anywhere where you engage. So like the men's shed or your local football pitch, wherever. But our generation is turning to our phones for our third
Oh,
space.
wow.
So we are no longer looking for in-person engagement. Instead, we're turning to online engagement to fulfill that need. But it's not lighting up the reward systems in our brain that in-person connection, it's like a false connection almost.
A hundred
And
percent.
it really resonated with
Yeah.
me.
And that is actually, you've articulated better maybe than I could about, like, part of our kind of theory of, like, how remote working helps the country is, like, so before the pandemic, when obviously remote working accelerated exponentially in the country, one of the big issues that would have been facing remote workers would have been isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So we would have organised a lot of kind of chapter activity. That's what we call our community groups that come together. And that was really to counteract that isolation, because remote workers spend all day on their laptops. So
Yeah.
it's better that, you know, their social activity isn't online, then they need to be meeting up face to face. Whether that's like just for a drink on a Friday night, that would replicate, you know, the experience of if you were in an office and you were going for a drink with colleagues or whatever. Or any other activity. Our community activity is growing now. It includes lots of stuff like everything from kayaking to you know, people going on pet walks together, or it could be just meetups. Or we actually have a very unusual. We have a speed dating one coming up in Cork for Valentine's Day. Well, apparently a lot of remote workers, like, they move to an area with their job, and if I've struggled, they do, like, a lot of people meet their partners through work. So it's
and not even necessarily through work itself, but it could be on your commute to work, where you go after work, where you the pub beside your work. So it's everything connected to that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of filling that gap of people that are finding it hard to meet people because they are remote working.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It falls into loads of different categories.
It does. So
it does.
But really, it's interesting. People think if you advocate for remote work, that you advocate that everything should be done online. It's not like that at all.
No.
Like, it's, you know, if work can be done online, great, particularly if it brings other benefits to your life, like you don't need to commute, and that you can invest that time you save into your local community. But that time you save that you're investing into local community, that's the precious stuff. That's the stuff that can be done face to face, where you meet your neighbours. Even if it's only going for a walk with your neighbour, it adds to the social cohesion of the country.
Yeah, because if you're working remotely, you have less commuting time and more time therefore to spend in your communities, like the men's shed. So it kind of it comes 360, as you said.
100%. Yeah.
There's definitely a direct link there. And so looking forward then, do you hope to continue working in the non-profit sector? I know you're no longer active obviously with the Irish Men's Shed, but do you hope that you'll always find a space within?
Yeah, well, I don't.
Yeah.
Even though I've had a very interesting career, I don't plan it that carefully.
No,
so
you started off in farming, am I right? And then you moved. Yeah.
So I think, but like, I believe that the potential that remote working has, that we're only really at the tip of the iceberg, and the next few years are critical. Like, so can't really see past that, but that's definitely the short to medium term, is trying to like help transform Ireland using remote working, and not just Ireland. I think it's obviously a big international phenomenon as well. But I do understand that Grow Remote, I think, is the only organisation that is coming at remote working from the social impact perspective. There's lots of great organisations involved in remote working, but it's more about, you know, the productivity from a company perspective. You know, or people find, you know, digital nomads who can travel with their work and stuff. But it's very different when we're trying to land good jobs in rural areas.
Yeah. And it is so important for the future of Ireland and rural development itself.
Yeah.
Look, John, that's all fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. Like, hearing about your story from the very beginnings of the Men's Shed Association to where it is now, and what you've also then went on to do with Grow Remote and in the non-profit sector. It's fair to say you've had a fantastic impact in your career.
Thanks very much.
And I look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.